The Galactic Assembly has existed for millennia as a civilized council of advanced species. When humanity finally makes contact, they are dismissed as primitive newcomers. However, during humanity's first diplomatic session, an ancient threat emerges that forces humans to reveal their true nature, a species forged by endless conflict and possessed of a savage adaptability that shocks the galaxy. Character framework: Marcus Chen, human diplomat, former military officer, hiding his combat experience. Ambassador Veltar, arrogant Zeridian council member who underestimates humans. High Chancellor Mordun, ancient Cathari leader who recognizes the threat. The Void Swarm, ancient parasitic entities that consumed civilizations eons ago. Story structure: first document. The underestimation: humanity arrives at the assembly station for first contact negotiations. Other species mock human primitive technology and warfare-focused history. Marcus maintains diplomatic composure while internally noting tactical weaknesses. Ancient monitoring systems detect something approaching from deep space. The session is interrupted by emergency alerts. Something is coming reveals the approaching threat has been dormant for thousands of years. Assembly species panic as they realize their advanced weapons are useless. Marcus quietly begins tactical assessment while others argue. Second document. The Awakening. Void Swarm entities breach the station's defenses effortlessly. Advanced alien weaponry proves ineffective against adaptive parasites. Assembly members retreat in terror as creatures begin assimilating them. Marcus drops diplomatic pretense and takes command, reveals extensive military experience, and begins coordinating resistance. Uses primitive human tactics like guerrilla warfare and improvised weapons. Other species watch in shock as humans adapt instantly to the threat. Marcus leads successful evacuation of critical areas using unconventional methods. Establishes that human savagery is actually supreme adaptability. Third document. The Revelation. Final confrontation with Void Swarm requires sacrifice and brutal tactics. Marcus coordinates a desperate plan using the station's core systems. Requires hand-to-hand combat in areas other species cannot survive. Humans demonstrate their ability to function under extreme conditions. The victory comes at great cost but saves the assembly. Aftermath reveals humans evolved specifically to survive impossible odds. Assembly realizes humanity's primitive nature is actually their greatest strength. New respect and fear for human capabilities established. Ends with humans being offered a permanent seat on the War Council. The massive diplomatic station hung suspended in the void between star systems, its crystalline spires reaching into darkness like the fingers of some ancient god. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Assembly had conducted its business within these walls, where 17 different species had gathered to maintain peace across known space. Today marked a historic moment, the first formal introduction of humanity to the galactic community. Marcus Chen adjusted his simple black uniform as he walked through corridors designed for beings much larger than himself. The ceiling stretched nearly 30 feet above his head, accommodated the towering Cathari delegates with their segmented exoskeletons. Bioluminescent panels provided light in spectrums that hurt human eyes, casting everything in an otherworldly blue-green glow. Other species moved past him with barely concealed disdain, their conversations filled with whispered observations about the new primitive arrivals. Ambassador Veltar of the Zeridian Republic stood nearly 8 feet tall, his silver skin gleaming under the artificial lights. His 4 eyes tracked Marcus's approach with the kind of attention one might give to an interesting insect. When the human delegation entered the main assembly chamber, Veltar's melodious voice carried across the vast space with deliberate volume. "So these are the famous humans we have heard so much about," he announced to his companions, his tone dripping with amusement. "Look how small they are. And those crude chemical-based weapons they bring to every conflict. Do they truly believe such tools have any place in civilized discourse?" The hegemony representative, a creature resembling a floating jellyfish with tentacles that sparked with electrical energy, pulsed with colors that Marcus had learned indicated laughter. "I reviewed their military history before this session," the being communicated through bioelectric fields translated by the station's systems. "They still use projectile weapons. Actual metal fragments propelled by explosive charges. How wonderfully primitive." Marcus maintained his diplomatic expression, though his fingers unconsciously tapped against his thigh in a pattern his old unit would have recognized as a tactical Morse code signal. His eyes swept the chamber not with wonder at its architectural magnificence, but with the practiced gaze of someone assessing sightlines, cover positions, and potential defensive choke points. The habit was so ingrained he hardly realized he was doing it. High Chancellor Mordun of the Cathari observed the human delegation with ancient eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Unlike his younger colleagues, the Chancellor remembered stories from the old archives, warnings about species that survived by adapting rather than advancing. But, even he viewed humanity as merely another curious addition to their cosmic community. "Welcome, representatives of Earth," Mordun's voice resonated through specialized speakers that translated his chittering language into human-comprehensible words. "We gather today to formally acknowledge your species' achievement of faster-than-light travel and extend an invitation to join our assembly as junior members." The term junior members sparked murmurs of approval from the assembled delegates. Marcus noticed how they positioned themselves, the Zeridians with their energy-based weaponry clearly visible, the hegemony floating in formation that suggested military discipline, the smaller species clustering behind larger allies. Every species here had earned their place through technological advancement, philosophical achievement, or economic power. Humanity brought none of these credentials in sufficient measure to impress anyone present. "We are honored by this invitation," Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. He had chosen his words carefully during the 3-month journey to this station. "Earth hopes to contribute meaningfully to the peace and prosperity you have built together." A series of harmonic tones from the melodic concordat indicated what their translation protocols identified as polite skepticism. One of their representatives, a being that resembled a living crystal formation, chimed a response that echoed through the chamber. "Your contribution will undoubtedly be educational for us all. We look forward to learning how a species that has spent its entire recorded history in constant warfare might adapt to our peaceful coexistence." The comment drew appreciative sounds from several delegations. Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his diplomatic training held firm. These beings saw humanity's military history as a liability, a sign of evolutionary failure to transcend violence. They had no concept that constant conflict might forge something stronger than peace. Dr. Sarah Kim, the human xenobiologist who had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, stepped forward with a data tablet displaying Earth's cultural achievements. "Humanity brings unique perspectives on adaptation and survival," she offered. "Our artistic traditions, our scientific methodologies, our social structures all have been shaped by our ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges." Veltar's 4 eyes focused on the tablet's display, showing images of human art, architecture, and technological development. "Fascinating," he mused with the tone of someone examining museum pieces. "Your species appears to romanticize conflict. These images celebrate warriors and battles rather than the scholars and peacekeepers we typically honor. Tell me, Dr. Kim, how does a species that glorifies violence contribute to galactic harmony?" Before Dr. Kim could respond, a low vibration thrummed through the station's hull. It started as barely perceptible tremor, but within seconds had grown to a resonance that made the crystal delegates chime involuntarily. Emergency lights began flashing in patterns specific to each species' visual range, and the chamber's central display activated without any delegate requesting it. A holographic projection showed the space surrounding the diplomatic station, rendered in 3-dimensional detail that allowed every delegate to observe from their species' optimal viewing angle. At the edge of the display, barely visible against the cosmic background, something massive was approaching. The object, if it could be called a single object, defied easy categorization. It moved with purpose but lacked the clean lines of constructed technology. Instead, it seemed to writhe and pulse like something alive. Chancellor Mordun's exoskeleton plates shifted with agitation as he accessed the station's sensor networks through his neural interface. "Impossible," he chittered. "The deep space monitors show this entity emerged from the void reaches. Nothing has come from that region for over 4,000 years. The hegemony representative's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that indicated severe alarm. Our historical archives contain warnings about that sector. Ancient texts speak of entities that consumed entire civilizations before retreating into the dark between galaxies." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, not fear, but the familiar weight of recognition that came before combat. While the other delegates erupted into confused discussion, he was already calculating distances, approach vectors, and the defensive capabilities of a diplomatic station that had never been designed for warfare. "Ambassador Veltar," he called out, his voice cutting through the rising chaos with military precision. "What are the station's defensive protocols?" The Zeridian turned to him with obvious irritation. Defensive protocols? This is a diplomatic facility, human. We have energy barriers to protect against cosmic radiation and micrometeorites. We have never needed weapons because civilized species resolve conflicts through discourse, not violence. The approaching entity on the display had grown noticeably larger. Marcus estimated they had perhaps 20 minutes before contact, assuming the object maintained its current acceleration. Around him, delegates were engaging in increasingly frantic communication with their homeworlds, seeking guidance from leaders who were thousands of light-years away. Dr. Kim moved to Marcus's side, her scientific training overriding the growing panic around them. The sensor readings are unlike anything in our xenobiology databases, she whispered. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't match any known energy signatures or biological markers. Marcus nodded, his mind already shifting into tactical mode despite the diplomatic setting. His fingers continued their unconscious tapping pattern, a habit from his days commanding special operations units in Earth's most remote and hostile regions. The pattern had once coordinated ambushes in alien environments where standard communication would have meant death. Now it helped him think through impossible situations where conventional solutions failed. The entity on the display pulsed, and, suddenly, every sensor array on the station registered massive energy spikes. Warning klaxons began sounding in frequencies designed to alert all 17 member species simultaneously. The cacophony was overwhelming, a symphony of panic that filled the chamber with discordant noise. High Chancellor Mordon accessed the station's communication systems, his ancient voice carrying the authority of 3 millennia in leadership. All assembly members, we are implementing emergency protocols. Defensive barriers are activating, and distress signals have been transmitted to all homeworlds. Please remain calm while we assess the situation. But Marcus could see what the others couldn't, or perhaps what they refused to acknowledge. The approaching entity moved with intelligence, adjusting its course to approach the station from an angle that would minimize the effectiveness of any energy-based defenses. Its irregular pulsing matched no natural phenomenon he had studied, but it reminded him of something else entirely, the coordination patterns used by Earth's most dangerous predators when they hunted in groups. As the chamber erupted into frightened discussions in 17 different languages, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He activated his personal communicator and sent a coded message to the 3 other humans in his delegation. The message was brief and would have meant nothing to any non-human translator, but to his team it carried a single clear instruction: prepare for the worst-case scenario they had spent months training for but hoped never to face. The universe was about to discover what humanity had learned during millions of years of evolution in Earth's unforgiving environment. Sometimes survival required embracing the very savagery that civilized species worked so hard to transcend. Marcus Chen had spent his entire career learning to be diplomatic, but before that, he had spent decades learning something far more fundamental. He had learned how to win when victory seemed impossible, and how to fight when fighting meant the difference between life and extinction. The Galactic Assembly was about to witness capabilities they had never imagined, forged by a species that had earned its place in the universe through trials that would have destroyed any other civilization. The entity on the display pulsed again, and Marcus felt the familiar calm that settled over him before battle. Around him, the most advanced civilizations in known space prepared to face something their peaceful evolution had left them utterly unprepared to handle. But humanity had never had the luxury of peaceful evolution, and that difference was about to save them all. The station's defensive barriers activated with a sound like crystalline wind chimes shattering in perfect harmony. Energy fields designed to deflect cosmic debris and regulate atmospheric pressure suddenly became humanity's first glimpse of how the galaxy's most advanced civilizations prepared for threats. The barriers shimmered across the station's hull like aurora borealis, beautiful and utterly inadequate for what was approaching. Marcus watched the holographic display as the entity made contact with the outer defensive perimeter. For a moment, the energy fields held, creating brilliant flashes where the unknown force met Cathari engineering that had protected assembly facilities for millennia. Then, the barriers began to fluctuate, their steady geometric patterns becoming erratic as something started learning how to bypass them. Impossible, Ambassador Veltar breathed, his 4 eyes fixed on readouts that showed energy drain rates climbing beyond theoretical maximums. The barriers are adapting to our defensive frequencies. But that would require intelligence levels far beyond any known species. The first breach came at the station's lower hull, where the entity had somehow identified the exact resonance frequency needed to destabilize the barrier matrix. Warning lights bathed the assembly chamber in urgent crimson as automated systems reported hull breaches in sections that should have been impenetrable. Dr. Kim grabbed Marcus's arm as the artificial gravity fluctuated. "The sensor readings are changing," she whispered urgently. "Whatever penetrated our defenses is breaking down into smaller components. Thousands of them." Through the station's internal monitoring systems, they could see the invaders for the first time. The entities defied easy description. They moved like liquid shadow given predatory purpose, flowing through corridors with movements that suggested both organic intelligence and mechanical precision. Where they encountered the station's automated security systems, the machines simply stopped functioning, not destroyed but somehow converted to serve new purposes. The hegemony representative's electrical fields crackled with panic as reports flooded in from across the station. "Our energy weapons have no effect," the being communicated through rapid bioelectric pulses. "The entities absorb directed energy and use it to replicate themselves. We have made them stronger." Chancellor Mordun's ancient wisdom finally provided context that chilled every delegate in the chamber. "The void swarm," he chittered, his exoskeleton plates rattling with recognition. "The archives speak of entities that consumed the predecessor civilizations. They adapt to any technology used against them and assimilate the knowledge of every species they encounter." Marcus felt the familiar shift in his mind that came when diplomatic necessity gave way to survival imperative. Around him, the most advanced beings in known space were discovering that their technological superiority meant nothing against an enemy that could turn their own innovations into weapons against them. "Dr. Kim," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone that had once coordinated special operations across 3 different continents, "get to the emergency communications array. Send everything we've recorded to Earth. All data about these entities, their capabilities, and the station's layout." "Marcus, what are you?" she began, but stopped when she saw the change in his expression. The diplomatic mask had fallen away completely, replaced by something that reminded her why humanity had survived every extinction event their planet had ever produced. The chamber's main display now showed internal security feeds from across the station. The void swarm moved through corridors like a living tide, and, wherever they encountered the assembly's various species, the result was the same. The entities flowed over their victims, and, within moments, those beings rose again with movements that were familiar yet wrong, as if puppeted by intelligence that understood their bodies but not their souls. Ambassador Veltar backed away from the display, his silver skin losing its luster as panic took hold. "We must evacuate immediately. Contact our respective fleets and retreat to a safe distance while military forces deal with this threat." "Your military forces use the same energy-based weapons that are feeding these things," Marcus interrupted, and, for the first time since arriving at the station, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions in seconds rather than hours. "Every ship that arrives will just give them more power to work with." The Zeridian turned to him with growing irritation. "And what would you suggest, human? Your primitive projectile weapons? Your crude chemical explosives? This is a threat that requires advanced technology and coordinated response from civilized military forces." Marcus walked to the chamber's central control console, his movements purposeful in a way that made several delegates step back involuntarily. "Dr. Kim, how long until the communications array is down?" She checked her readings with shaking hands. "The entities are moving through the station's network infrastructure. Maybe 10 minutes before they control all electronic systems." "Then, we have 10 minutes to do this the hard way," Marcus said, beginning to access the station's emergency protocols through commands that required manual authorization from assembly delegates. "Chancellor Mordun, I need access to the station's maintenance systems. Environmental controls, artificial gravity, atmospheric processing, everything that keeps this place habitable." The ancient Cathari leader hesitated, his compound eyes reflecting doubt. "Those systems could kill us all if mismanaged." "What are you proposing?" I'm proposing we stop thinking like civilized beings and start thinking like survivors, Marcus replied, his fingers already dancing across control interfaces designed for species with entirely different hand configurations. Your energy weapons feed them. Your advanced technology gives them new abilities. But, they're still physical entities that need certain environmental conditions to function. Ambassador Veltar's four eyes widened with horror as understanding dawned. You want to turn the station's life support systems into weapons? That is barbaric. Uncivilized. It could kill innocent civilians. The civilians are already dead or worse, Marcus snapped, pulling up environmental readouts that showed atmospheric composition throughout the facility. Look at your sensor feeds. Every person those things touch becomes something else. We can mourn the casualties later, but right now we need to create conditions these entities can't adapt to. The first Void Swarm entities reached the outer perimeter of the assembly chamber, their forms visible through the reinforced viewing ports that lined the walls. Up close, they were even more disturbing, constantly shifting between states that suggested both organic life and technological construct, as if they existed in multiple dimensional phases simultaneously. Dr. Kim's voice crackled over the communication system from her position at the emergency array. Marcus, I'm seeing energy patterns that suggest they're trying to interface with the station's main computer core. If they gain access to the assembly databases, they'll have information about every member species. Then, we cut the power, Marcus said, his hands moving across environmental controls with precision born from countless hours studying the technical specifications his team had been provided. Everything electronic, everything that can be turned against us. We go dark and fight them with tools they can't understand or assimilate. The chamber's lights flickered and died as Marcus systematically shut down every electronic system he could access. Emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in a hellish red glow that was somehow more honest than the sterile illumination they had lost. Around him, delegates who had spent their entire lives surrounded by technological marvels found themselves suddenly dependent on the most basic necessities of survival. You are condemning us all, Veltar accused, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Through the viewing ports, they could see the Void Swarm entities hesitating, their forms flickering as they lost access to the electronic systems they had been using to navigate and coordinate. Marcus drew something from beneath his diplomatic jacket, a simple chemical sidearm that would have seemed laughably primitive to any assembly member just hours before. Maybe, he acknowledged, checking the weapon with practiced efficiency. But I'm also giving us a chance to fight back with tools they can't turn against us. The chamber's main door began to bulge inward as something pressed against it from outside. The Void Swarm had found them, and whatever they were about to face would not be stopped by energy barriers or advanced technology. Everyone who can move, get to the emergency stations along the outer walls, Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made even proud species representatives obey without question. Find anything physical you can use as a weapon. Tools, debris, anything that doesn't depend on electronics. Chancellor Mordun's ancient mind grasped the desperate logic faster than his younger colleagues. He is correct, the Cathari leader chittered to the assembled delegates. These entities adapt to technology, but they may not understand tactics developed by species that survive through physical capability rather than technological advancement. The door finally gave way, and the first Void Swarm entities flowed into the chamber like intelligent liquid nightmare. They moved with purpose toward the gathered delegates, but their advance faltered as Marcus opened fire with his primitive chemical weapon. The projectiles passed through their semi-physical forms without apparent effect, but the entities recoiled from each impact as if confused by attacks they couldn't analyze or counter. They don't understand kinetic weapons, Marcus called out as he dove behind cover that would have been useless against energy weapons but provided adequate protection against entities that moved like liquid. They've adapted to absorb energy, but they don't know how to process physical impact. Dr. Kim's voice echoed through the chamber's manual address system, powered by nothing more sophisticated than mechanical acoustic amplifiers. Marcus, I've got communication with Earth. They're sending what data they can about primitive warfare tactics. Apparently the military has been developing contingency plans for fighting technologically superior enemies. Around the chamber, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations began learning lessons that humanity had mastered before they learned to make fire. They grabbed maintenance tools and decorative objects, anything solid enough to serve as weapons against enemies that could turn their greatest achievements against them. Ambassador Veltar found himself clutching a crystal formation torn from a wall ornament, his four eyes wide with the realization that his species' greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. The beings who had mocked humanity's primitive weapons were discovering that sometimes primitive was exactly what survival required. The Void Swarm pressed their attack, but, for the first time since arriving at the station, they encountered resistance they couldn't immediately overcome. The entities that had effortlessly adapted to energy weapons and advanced technology were confused by simple kinetic force, crude chemical reactions, and tactical approaches that predated interstellar civilization. Marcus coordinated the defense with hand signals and shouted commands, using battlefield tactics that had been refined through millions of years of human conflict. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most advanced response to an impossible threat was to abandon advancement entirely and embrace the savage efficiency of species that had earned their place in the universe through nothing more sophisticated than the will to survive. The makeshift barricade held for exactly 17 minutes before the Void Swarm adapted to kinetic attacks. Marcus watched through the emergency periscope as the entities began coordinating their movements, no longer flowing like liquid but moving with tactical precision that suggested they were learning from every impact, every defensive position, every human strategy they encountered. "They're getting smarter," Dr. Kim reported from her position at the manual communications array, her voice strained as she coordinated with Earth through equipment that belonged in a museum rather than a diplomatic facility. "Each encounter teaches them something new about physical combat." Chancellor Mordun crouched behind an overturned ceremonial table, his ancient exoskeleton scarred from debris that had once been the chamber's magnificent artwork. "The archives speak of this," he chittered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of improvised warfare. "The predecessor civilizations fought them for centuries. Every victory taught the swarm how to win the next battle." Marcus reloaded his sidearm with movements that had become automatic through decades of practice, his mind calculating ammunition remaining against entities destroyed. The mathematics were not encouraging. Around him, 17 different species were learning that survival sometimes required abandoning everything that made them civilized, but they were learning too slowly and at too high a cost. Ambassador Veltar had lost his diplomatic composure entirely, his silver skin darkened with stress patterns as he wielded a maintenance tool against entities that defied every principle of physics his species had mastered. "This is hopeless," he gasped between desperate strikes at shadows that sometimes became solid enough to hurt. "They adapt to everything we do. There is no strategy they cannot counter." "There is one," Marcus said quietly, his fingers accessing the station's environmental controls one final time. Around him, the surviving delegates turned to listen as he outlined a plan that would have been unthinkable to any civilized species. "But it requires someone to reach the station's core manually and override safety protocols that were designed to prevent exactly what I'm proposing." The route to the station's central core lay through sections that the Void Swarm had completely overrun. The entities had transformed those areas into something that resembled their own dimensional space more than conventional reality. Energy readings showed environmental conditions that would kill most known species within seconds, and the entities themselves had grown stronger by absorbing power from every system they controlled. "It's a suicide mission," Dr. Kim stated with scientific precision, though her voice carried undertones of pride and terror that had nothing to do with xenobiology. "The core is surrounded by environmental hazards that would challenge even human physiology, and that's before considering the concentrated swarm presence." Marcus nodded, checking his equipment one final time. His diplomatic uniform had been replaced by emergency gear cobbled together from maintenance supplies and survival equipment that every human delegation carried out of habit rather than necessity. The galaxy's most advanced species had mocked these preparations as primitive paranoia. Now those same supplies represented their only hope for survival. "The station's core contains gravitational manipulation technology," he explained to delegates who were struggling to understand concepts their species had never needed to master. "If I can override the safety protocols and reverse the gravitational field generators, it will create a collapse effect that should disrupt the entity's dimensional cohesion." Chancellor Mordun's compound eyes reflected calculations that span millennia of accumulated wisdom. "Such an action would destroy the station entirely," he acknowledged. "And the gravitational disruption would likely kill anyone still aboard." Not necessarily, Marcus corrected, pulling up manual schematics that showed the station's emergency escape systems. Your evacuation pods are mechanically launched, not electronically controlled. If the timing is precise, we can use the gravitational pulse to accelerate the pods beyond the swarm's ability to pursue. The plan required coordination that bordered on impossible. While Marcus fought his way to the station's core, the surviving delegates would need to manually prepare evacuation pods using systems they barely understood, operated by species whose physiology was never intended for such equipment. Worse, they would have only minutes to execute the evacuation once the gravitational field began reversing. Ambassador Veltar looked around the chamber at beings who represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization, now reduced to clutching crude weapons and preparing to flee in escape pods designed as last resort measures. "This is what we have become," he said with something approaching wonder. "The most advanced civilizations in known space, dependent on the tactical knowledge of a species we considered primitive." Marcus stood at the chamber's emergency exit, ready to venture into sections of the station that had become alien territory. Behind him, the galaxy's greatest minds prepared to implement a plan that depended entirely on principles their species had transcended millennia ago: individual sacrifice, desperate improvisation, and the willingness to destroy everything they had built rather than see it perverted by forces beyond their control. "Dr. Kim," he called out as he prepared to leave, "make sure Earth receives everything about what happened here. Every species profile, every tactical observation, everything about how the swarm operates. If this doesn't work, humanity needs to know what's coming." The journey through the station's compromised sections challenged every survival skill Marcus had developed during his military career. The Void Swarm had transformed corridors into spaces where physics operated according to rules that human science barely recognized. Gravity shifted without warning, atmosphere composition changed from breath to breath, and the entities themselves existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But humanity had evolved on a planet where survival required adapting to environments that ranged from Arctic tundra to desert extremes, from crushing ocean depths to oxygen-depleted mountain peaks. Where other species needed technological assistance to function outside their optimal conditions, humans had developed the biological flexibility to endure almost anything nature could produce. Marcus fought through environmental conditions that would have killed most assembly delegates instantly, his body automatically adjusting to pressure changes and atmospheric variations that his species had mastered through millions of years of evolutionary pressure. The Void Swarm entities attacked with increasing desperation as he approached the core, as if they recognized the threat he represented to their conquest. The station's central core hummed with power that had maintained artificial gravity and environmental controls for 3,000 years. Cathari engineering had created a masterpiece of technological achievement that regulated the fundamental forces of physics with precision that human science could barely comprehend. Marcus began the process of systematically dismantling those safety protocols, turning the station's greatest achievement into a weapon of mass destruction. As gravitational fields began destabilizing throughout the facility, the Void Swarm's coordinated intelligence finally recognized what was happening. They abandoned their systematic conquest of the station and converged on the core with desperate fury, pouring through dimensional rifts that bypassed normal space entirely. Marcus held his position with equipment that belonged in primitive warfare museums, fighting entities that represented the pinnacle of adaptive evolution with nothing more sophisticated than kinetic weapons and tactical knowledge developed by a species that had earned its place in the universe through endless conflict. The gravitational field reversed with a sound like reality itself screaming in protest. Throughout the station, the Void Swarm entities found their dimensional cohesion disrupted as the fundamental forces they depended on became chaotic and unpredictable. They flickered between dimensions, their adaptive capabilities overwhelmed by changes that occurred faster than even their enhanced intelligence could process. Emergency escape pods launched from the station's outer hull, carrying the survivors of 17 different species away from destruction that would reshape local space for centuries to come. The pod's mechanical launch systems, crude by assembly standards but utterly reliable, accelerated their passengers beyond the reach of entities that could no longer maintain coherent form in the gravitational chaos. Marcus never made it to an evacuation pod. The core's final collapse required manual oversight to ensure the gravitational pulse achieved maximum effect, and someone needed to remain behind to complete the sequence that would eliminate the swarm threat permanently. He died as he had lived, doing what needed to be done regardless of personal cost, using abilities his species had developed through trials that would have destroyed any other civilization. The rescue fleets that arrived 3 days later found empty space where the diplomatic station had existed for millennia. The gravitational disruption had created a localized phenomenon that would serve as a monument to sacrifice for eons to come. But they also found escape pods containing survivors who carried with them a new understanding of what humanity represented. Chancellor Mordun stood before the emergency assembly session convened on a backup facility, his ancient voice carrying the weight of witnessed truth. "We believed humanity was primitive because they had not transcended warfare," he told the gathered representatives. "We failed to understand that their experience with conflict had prepared them for threats we could not even recognize." Ambassador Veltar, his silver skin now bearing scars that would never heal, addressed delegates who had spent their lives believing that technological advancement represented the highest achievement of civilization. "The human Marcuscan saved us using tactics and equipment that we considered obsolete," he reported. "He succeeded where our most advanced weapons failed because he understood that some threats require responses that civilized species are unwilling or unable to provide." Dr. Kim, now serving as humanity's official representative to the Reformed Assembly, presented data that challenged every assumption the galaxy had made about evolutionary development. Earth's environment produced a species adapted for survival under impossible conditions, she explained to beings who were still struggling to process what they had witnessed. "Humanity's history of warfare taught us to think tactically under pressure, to improvise solutions using whatever resources are available, and to sacrifice individual comfort for collective survival." The Galactic Assembly's response to humanity changed overnight. No longer viewed as primitive newcomers seeking admission to advanced civilization, humans were offered positions of leadership in newly formed defense councils. Their experience with conflict, once seen as a liability, was now recognized as the galaxy's most valuable asset against threats that could turn technological advancement into a weakness. But perhaps the most significant change was philosophical. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations began reconsidering the assumption that transcending violence represented the pinnacle of evolutionary development. They had discovered that some challenges required embracing capabilities that civilization typically abandoned, and that survival sometimes demanded the willingness to become savage in defense of everything that civilization had achieved. Marcus Chen became a legend throughout known space, remembered not as a diplomat who failed to prevent conflict, but as a warrior who proved that humanity's greatest strength lay not in what they had become, but in what they had never forgotten. His sacrifice demonstrated that sometimes the most advanced response to an impossible threat was to abandon advancement entirely and embrace the savage efficiency that had carried humanity through every crisis their species had ever faced. The dawn the Assembly witnessed was not the emergence of humanity as another civilized species, but the revelation that civilization itself sometimes required the protection of those who remembered how to be uncivilized when survival demanded it. The galaxy had learned that their peaceful evolution had left them vulnerable to threats that could only be countered by species willing to embrace the very qualities that advanced civilizations worked to transcend. In the end, humanity's savage emergence saved them all.